On a calm Tuesday morning, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped from the trees, and the sound of distant traffic created a peaceful hum. The streets were mostly empty, except for a few early risers heading off to work. Among them was Maya, a confident and driven professional in her mid-30s. She had just moved to the city a few months ago and was settling into her new life. Today was important. It marked her first big presentation at the company she had recently joined. She had worked hard to get here, and now all she needed was a smooth morning to start things off right. Maya's car, a reliable sit-in, was parked along the side of the street in front of the building where she worked. The spot was perfectly legal. She had parked it well within the lines, not blocking any driveways or fire hydrants, as was required by the city's parking regulations. There was no reason to be concerned. She knew the rules, and she had followed them carefully. As Maya exited the car, she straightened her jacket and took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the day ahead. Today was her chance to make a lasting impression. As Maya turned toward the building's entrance, she noticed a police car slowly approaching. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, police cars often patrolled the area, and their presence was a normal part of the neighborhood's daily routine. However, as the car rolled closer, she could see the officer inside glancing at her car. His gaze lingered on her vehicle a little too long, and Maya felt a slight twinge of unease. The police car slowed to a stop right beside her car. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, stepped out. His uniform looked neat and crisp, but his demeanor seemed rigid, almost too serious for the calm morning. Without any warning, he began walking toward Maya's car. Maya, still a bit confused, turned to face him. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "This is illegal parking. You're going to have to move it." Maya raised an eyebrow, taken aback. She looked around, trying to understand what he meant. The street was mostly empty, and there was plenty of space around her car. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is illegal parking," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I checked, and I'm parked legally." The officer didn't seem interested in her explanation. Instead, his expression hardened. "No, it's not. I'm giving you a ticket for this. You need to move it right now," he insisted, crossing his arms. Maya felt a rush of confusion and frustration. She had parked exactly as she had done for the past several days without any issues. The officer was making it clear he wasn't interested in hearing her side. She felt as if something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. There had been no signs indicating a parking restriction, no yellow lines or special markings on the road. Still, the officer's words were authoritative, and his refusal to listen left her feeling helpless. With a sigh, Maya glanced at her watch. She was running out of time for her meeting. "Could you please double-check? I'm really sure this is fine," she said politely, trying to reason with him. The officer stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, to Maya's surprise, his eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to her car. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out a can of bright yellow spray paint from his belt. Maya's confusion turned to shock as he knelt beside her car, preparing to spray paint a large, bold line across the side of the vehicle. Without saying another word, he sprayed a large, garish, illegal parking on the car. Maya stood frozen for a moment, stunned by his actions. What had just happened? She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself at a loss for words. Maya stood there in complete shock, unable to process what was happening right in front of her. Her eyes followed the officer as he carelessly sprayed yellow paint on her car, marking it with bold letters that seemed to scream illegal parking. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach as she watched the paint dry on the surface of her once pristine vehicle. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why was he doing this? It didn't make any sense. There had been no warning, no signs to indicate she was parked illegally. She had been parked the same way for days without issue. So why was this happening now? "Excuse me, "What are you doing?" Maya finally managed to ask, her voice shaky but firm. The officer didn't look up at her, focused only on his task. He continued to spray the paint without acknowledging her, and it was like he didn't even hear her question. Maya took a step closer, still in disbelief at the situation. She reached out a hand, almost as if she hoped she could stop him somehow, but she didn't want to escalate things further. "Officer, please stop. This isn't necessary," she pleaded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm parked legally. You can check. I've followed all the parking rules." But the officer didn't respond. His expression was cold, and there was a strange stubbornness in the way he continued his task. It was as if he had already decided that this was a violation, no matter the facts. Maya's frustration grew. She had always prided herself on being calm and composed, but the more she tried to reason with him, the more helpless she felt. What could she do? How could she prove she was right when he seemed so certain of his own actions? A mix of anger and confusion bubbled up inside her. She glanced around, hoping someone would intervene, but the street remained quiet, with only a few distant cars passing by. There were no other people nearby who might have witnessed the scene or offered their support. She was on her own. The officer finally stood up, stepping back to admire his work. The bright yellow paint now marked her car, a stark contrast to the clean white exterior it had once had. Maya's heart sank further as she realized the damage was done. She knew the paint could be scrubbed off, but it would take time, and the fact that someone had done this to her car for no reason at all made it feel even worse. She stood there, feeling a mix of helplessness and disbelief, her mind trying to find a way to make sense of what had just happened. "Ma'am, you need to move the car. I'm issuing a fine." The officer finally spoke again, his tone cold and authoritative. "This is a violation." Maya was at a loss for words. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had dealt with difficult situations at work, but never had she been treated like this for something she knew was completely innocent. She felt a rush of frustration, but she refused to let herself get upset. Instead, she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She had to stay calm. "I'll move my car, but I'm not accepting that fine," Maya said firmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You're wrong about this, and I won't let it slide." She wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew she had to stand her ground. As the officer turned to leave, she began thinking about what to do next. Was there someone she could call? Was there a way to clear this up? She needed help, but she couldn't let herself be intimidated by this man. No matter what happened, she was going to get to the bottom of this and make sure it didn't happen again. Maya stood frozen for a moment as the officer walked away from her car, leaving her with nothing but the sound of the spray paint can rattling in his wake. She watched him return to his police car, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration swirl within her. The words "illegal parking" were boldly painted on the side of her car, mocking her innocence. She wanted to shout, to demand that he take it back, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked at the damage. It was hard to believe that just a few minutes ago, everything had been normal. She quickly glanced around, hoping someone might have witnessed what had just occurred. But the street remained empty, save for a few passing cars. No one had seen her argument with the officer. No one could back up her side of the story. It felt like she was alone in this moment, a small and insignificant incident that no one would care about. But that wasn't true. She wasn't alone. Maya wasn't one to let injustice slide, not when she knew she had done nothing wrong. Her mind raced as she thought of her options. She could just drive away and forget about it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple mistake. The officer had been too eager to make a judgment, and there was something about his tone, his attitude, that bothered her. She suspected this wasn't just about parking. It felt like something deeper was at play. But what could she do? She couldn't just let him walk away with no consequences for his actions. Maya took out her phone and dialed the number of her workplace. Her heart raced as she waited for someone to pick up. She needed advice, or at least someone to help her figure out what to do next. "Hello," came the voice of Sarah, one of her colleagues at the office. "Hey, it's Maya," she said, trying to sound calm. "I need your help with something." "What's going on?" Sarah asked, concerned. "There's been an incident," Maya began, recounting the entire story. She told Sarah about the officer, about the spray paint, and about how she had tried to explain that she was parked legally, but the officer refused to listen. "Wait, he did what?" Sarah's voice grew louder in disbelief. "That's crazy. You're sure this is all just a misunderstanding, right?" "Unsure," Maya replied, her voice steady. "I know I was parked legally. This doesn't make sense." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Sarah processed the information. "I think you should report it," she finally suggested. "That's not okay. He can't just spray paint your car like that." Maya hesitated. She didn't want to make things more complicated. She was already feeling vulnerable and upset, and she wasn't sure how far she wanted to take it. But Sarah was right. This wasn't just a small mistake. It was an abuse of power. The officer had no right to do what he did. "You're right," Maya said, the decision becoming clearer in her mind. "I'm going to report it." "Good," Sarah encouraged. "Let me know if you need any help. We'll support you." Maya hung up the phone and took another look at her car. She felt a sense of determination rising within her. It wasn't just about the spray paint. It was about standing up for herself, for her rights. The officer had acted without reason, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She would make sure her voice was heard. With renewed resolve, Maya got into her car and started the engine. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it. As she drove to her office, her mind shifted to the next step, reporting the officer's actions. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let the incident slide. She would find a way to make it right. As Maya drove toward her office, she couldn't stop thinking about the scene that had just unfolded. The frustration and anger still simmered beneath her calm exterior, but she focused on keeping her mind clear. She couldn't let herself get too emotional about it. This was about something bigger than just a misunderstanding over parking. She was dealing with a situation that was unjust, and it needed to be addressed properly. The office building came into view, and Maya parked her car in the designated lot, making sure to park far enough from the entrance so that her car wasn't immediately noticeable. She didn't want the spray-painted words on her car to be the first thing anyone saw when they arrived. The last thing she needed was attention drawn to this situation before she had a chance to figure out how to handle it. Taking a deep breath, Maya grabbed her bag and walked toward the entrance of the building. She needed to find her boss, Greg, as soon as possible. He was the one who could help her navigate this situation. As a senior member of the company, he had dealt with all sorts of issues, big and small. If anyone could help her figure out the best course of action, it was him. When Maya reached the office, she walked straight to Greg's office, her mind still racing with thoughts of the officer's actions. She knocked lightly on the door and stepped inside when she heard Greg's voice calling her in. "Morning, Maya. You're here early," Greg said, looking up from his desk with a smile. "What's on your mind?" Maya hesitated for a moment before speaking. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but she also knew it was important to get it off her chest. "Greg, I need to talk to you about something that happened this morning." Greg frowned slightly, sensing the seriousness in her voice. "Sure, what happened?" Maya took a seat across from him and began telling the story, starting with the cop approaching her car. She explained how the officer had accused her of illegal parking, despite the fact that she was parked within the lines and had followed all the rules. Then, she described how the officer had taken it upon himself to spray paint her car with the words "illegal parking," without even giving her a chance to explain herself. Greg listened attentively, his expression becoming more serious with every word. Maya could see that he was processing everything carefully. He leaned forward in his chair once she finished speaking, his eyes focused on hers. "That's a terrible situation, Maya," Greg said quietly. No one should have to go through something like that. It sounds like this officer took things way too far. I just don't understand, Maya said, her voice tinged with confusion. I've been parked there for days with no issue. Why would he single me out like this? And why was he so quick to escalate things without listening to me? Greg nodded, understanding her frustration. Sometimes people act on assumptions or misunderstandings, but that doesn't excuse the way he treated you. We'll get this figured out, I promise you. Maya felt a small sense of relief at Greg's words. She had been worried about how he might react, but he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She knew he had a lot of experience dealing with difficult situations, and his reassurance made her feel a little more confident. Greg sat back in his chair and thought for a moment. I think the first thing we should do is report the officer's actions to the department. We can't let this slide. But we also need to make sure you're not punished or penalized in any way for something that wasn't your fault. Maya nodded, feeling a sense of validation. This wasn't just about getting her car cleaned up. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, especially those in positions of power. She wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. Thank you, Greg, she said, grateful for his support. I didn't know where to turn at first, but I'm glad I came to you. No problem at all, Greg replied with a reassuring smile. We'll take care of this. You've got nothing to worry about. With Greg's guidance, Maya felt more confident about the steps she needed to take. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy process, but at least she wasn't alone in it. She left his office feeling more determined than ever to stand up for herself and make sure the officer's actions didn't go unaddressed. This wasn't just about a car. It was about respect, fairness, and doing what was right. Maya left Greg's office feeling a bit more at ease. His support meant a lot, and she now had a clearer sense of what she needed to do next. As she walked back to her desk, her thoughts began to settle. She had a plan. The officer's actions weren't going to go unnoticed, and she wouldn't let this be swept under the rug. But she also realized that things might get complicated. She had to stay calm and focused on making sure everything was handled professionally. She spent the next few hours at work, but the situation was never far from her mind. Every time she glanced out of the office window, she thought about the yellow paint still drying on her car. It seemed impossible that it had only been a few hours since the encounter. It felt like a dream. A bad one. But she kept reminding herself that this wasn't just about a car. This was about standing up for what was right. She wouldn't let herself be intimidated or brushed aside. At lunchtime, Maya decided it was time to take the next step. She had already written down a brief summary of the incident, and now she needed to visit the local police station to report what had happened. Gray had advised her to stay calm and make sure she had all the facts clear when she approached them. He had told her that the police department would take the matter seriously, especially since it involved an abuse of power. But Maya couldn't shake the nervousness she felt. What if they didn't take her seriously? What if the officer got away with it? She took a deep breath, grabbed her purse, and left the office. The walk to the police station was short, but it gave her time to clear her mind and gather her thoughts. When she arrived, she walked up to the counter and explained the situation to the officer at the front desk. The officer nodded as Maya spoke, but it was hard to tell if he was truly listening. "Do you have any evidence?" the officer asked after a moment, his tone neutral. Maya hesitated for a second before she answered. "I have photos of the paint on my car. I also have a written statement from my boss, who witnessed the situation." The officer nodded again, making notes on his pad. "All right, we'll look into this. We'll need you to fill out a formal complaint form and provide us with any other details you can. We'll follow up on this." Maya felt a bit of relief, but the officer's detached demeanor made her uneasy. It was hard to know whether they were truly going to take her complaint seriously. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had taken the first step, and that was what mattered. She completed the forms and handed them in, feeling a little lighter with each piece of paperwork she submitted. This wasn't going to be easy, but at least she was doing something about it. As she left the police station, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Greg. "You did the right thing," it read. "Stay strong. We've got your back." Maya smiled at the message, feeling a sense of solidarity. She wasn't alone in this. The support of her boss and colleagues made her feel more confident in her decision. She still had a long road ahead of her, but she wasn't backing down. The officer's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the bigger issues that needed to be addressed. Maya knew that, and she was determined to make sure things change. Whether it was through reporting the officer's actions or helping raise awareness, she would make sure her voice was heard. By the time she returned to the office, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day had been long, and she was tired, but she couldn't afford to rest just yet. She had already taken the first step, and now she had to wait for the next. But no matter how long it took, Maya knew she was doing the right thing. She was standing up not just for herself, but for anyone who had been treated unfairly. And that was a cause worth fighting for. The following days felt like a blur to Maya. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of the officer's actions, the frustration, and the uncertainty about what would happen next. She continued her work, pushing through meetings and tasks, but it was hard not to think about the incident. Each time she passed the parking lot and saw her car, the bright yellow paint reminded her of how unfairly she had been treated. However, something unexpected happened that helped her hold on to her sense of resolve. A few days after she had filed a complaint with the police, Maya received a call from the officer in charge of the investigation. His voice was polite, even apologetic, as he explained that the department was taking the matter seriously. He told her that they were looking into the officer's conduct and that they would be reviewing his past interactions with the public as part of the investigation. At first, Maya felt a sense of relief. She had worried that the situation would be brushed aside, but now it seemed like the department was actually going to follow through. She felt validated in her decision to report the officer's behavior. Her heart lifted slightly as she imagined the possibility of the officer being held accountable for what he had done. But as the investigation progressed, Maya started to realize how long and drawn out the process was going to be. Weeks went by with little update. She called the department a couple of times, but each time she was told that the investigation was still ongoing. It was frustrating, and at times, Maya wondered if it was all worth it. Would anything really change? Would the officer's behavior be addressed? The uncertainty was draining. One day, Maya decided to check in with Greg about the situation. She walked into his office, feeling a bit worn out from the waiting. Greg looked up from his desk and smiled warmly when he saw her. "Hey, Maya, how's everything going with the investigation?" he asked. She sat down, feeling a little defeated. "It's still in progress. I haven't heard anything substantial yet. I keep getting told it's ongoing, but I'm not sure what that means anymore." Greg's expression softened, and he nodded. "I know the waiting game can be tough, but you've done the right thing by speaking up. This officer's behavior wasn't just wrong, it was unjust, and it needs to be addressed. It might take time, but I believe they'll get to the bottom of it." Maya smiled, grateful for Greg's words. He had always been supportive, and hearing his encouragement reminded her why she had started this process in the first place. "Thanks, Greg. I just hate feeling like I'm not getting anywhere." "I get it," he replied, "but sometimes these things take time. The important part is that you've made it clear this kind of behavior won't be ignored, and you're not alone in this. You have us behind you." The words lifted Maya's spirits, even if only a little. She left Greg's office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't easy, but she couldn't let herself give up. She had to see it through. And then, just as she was beginning to think that maybe she'd never hear anything again, Maya got a call that would change everything. It was the officer in charge of the investigation, and this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the same detached tone from before. This time, he seemed more serious. "Maya, I wanted to update you on the case. After looking into the officer's past actions, we've decided to take disciplinary action. We've reviewed his history, and there have been several other complaints against him. We're taking this very seriously, and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Maya felt a mix of emotions as she processed the officer's words. Relief, satisfaction, and even a bit of pride swirled within her. The officer would face consequences, and perhaps most importantly, she knew that her voice had been heard. It wasn't just about her car anymore. It was about making sure this kind of behavior didn't happen to anyone else. She had made a difference. As Maya hung up the phone, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The process hadn't been easy, and it had taken longer than she had hoped, but it was worth it. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had helped bring about change. The officer's actions had been wrong, but now they would be addressed. Maya smiled to herself, knowing that this was a victory, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The days following the phone call from the officer in charge were filled with a mixture of emotions. Maya felt a sense of relief, but there was still a lingering uncertainty in her mind. She had done everything she could, but now it was up to the authorities to carry out the disciplinary action and ensure the officer faced the consequences of his actions. As time passed, the experience of having to stand up for herself began to feel like a distant memory, but it had also become a part of who she was. Her coworkers, especially Greg, were incredibly supportive throughout the entire process. They continued to check in with her, offering encouragement and asking if she needed anything. Maya was grateful for their understanding, but there was something about the whole ordeal that made her feel more introspective. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the bigger picture, the way people in positions of power sometimes took advantage of their authority, and how important it was to hold them accountable. Maya had learned a lot during this time, and it had changed her in ways she hadn't fully expected. One afternoon, Maya received an unexpected email from the police department. It was an official notification, confirming that the officer involved had been disciplined, and his actions were being taken seriously. The email outlined the steps the department had taken, including an internal review and additional training for the officer on how to handle situations involving the public. Maya read the email carefully, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She had taken a stand, and it had made a difference. But it wasn't just the officer's punishment that mattered to Maya. What mattered more was that the system had responded. She had pushed back against what was wrong, and the right thing had happened in the end. She felt proud of herself for not backing down, for speaking up when she knew something wasn't right. It wasn't always easy, but standing up for herself and others was a powerful thing to do. The following week, Maya was invited to a meeting with Greg. As she sat down in his office, he smiled at her, clearly pleased. "I just wanted to let you know how proud I am of the way you handled everything," he said. "You didn't just let it go, and you made sure the right steps were taken. That's something a lot of people wouldn't have done." Maya smiled back, feeling the warmth spread through her. "Thanks, Greg. It wasn't easy, but I felt like it was something I had to do." Greg nodded. "And you did it. You took action, and it worked out. You stood your ground, and that's something to be proud of." Maya felt grateful for Greg's support. It had made the whole process feel less isolating, and she realized that this experience had strengthened her sense of self. She wasn't just a passive observer in her own life anymore. She was an active participant, someone who could make a change when necessary. A few days later, Maya had the chance to speak with the officer again. He approached her at the local coffee shop, where she had stopped to grab a drink after work. He seemed uncomfortable, his posture stiff, but he came up to her anyway. "Maya, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for what happened," he said. "I was wrong, and I didn't handle the situation the right way." Maya studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. It wasn't often that someone in a position of authority admitted their mistakes, but something about his apology seemed genuine. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It means a lot to me." He nodded, looking relieved. "I'll do better in the future," he added before turning and walking away. Maya watched him go, feeling a sense of closure. It wasn't about holding grudges or seeking revenge. It was about learning, growing, and making sure that the mistakes of the past didn't repeat themselves. She had stood up for what was right. And now, it seemed like the officer was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. That night, as Maya sat in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced a difficult situation and had come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't just about what had happened with the officer. It was about the lessons she had learned, the importance of standing up for herself, the power of taking action, and the belief that one person's voice could make a difference. The experience had made her more confident, more determined, and more aware of her own strength. She knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would be ready to face them head-on, just as she had with the officer. It was a small victory, but it was hers, and it mattered. Weeks had passed since Maya received the apology from the officer, and while the incident had been resolved, its impact lingered. She had learned so much during this time, about herself, about standing up for what was right, and about the sometimes slow process of seeking justice. But more than anything, it had instilled in her a newfound sense of confidence. She was no longer just the person who quietly accepted situations as they came. Now she was someone who could speak up, take action, and make her voice heard. As the days went on, Maya couldn't help but reflect on how the experience had shaped her. At work, she felt more empowered, not just in handling difficult situations, but in every aspect of her life. The lesson she'd learned about persistence and standing up for herself was something she carried with her, both in the office and beyond. Her coworkers, especially Greg, continued to offer their support and praise, but it wasn't just their approval that mattered. It was her own sense of pride in what she had accomplished. One afternoon, while Maya was at her desk, she received a message from the police department. It was a follow-up email that detailed the completion of the internal review regarding the officer's behavior. The department had confirmed that they had followed through with the disciplinary actions and that additional training had been implemented for officers involved in similar situations. Maya felt a sense of closure as she read the email, knowing that the matter had been handled appropriately. While she knew it wasn't about receiving recognition for her actions, there was a part of her that felt gratified by the outcome. She had done the right thing, and it had made a difference. That weekend, Maya took some time to herself. She decided to visit a park she hadn't been to in months, seeking a little peace and quiet. As she walked through the familiar paths, her mind was at ease. The weather was perfect. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long, gentle shadows on the ground. She found a bench by the lake and sat down, watching the ducks swim lazily in the water. It was moments like this that reminded her of the importance of taking a step back and appreciating the simple things in life. As she sat there, a thought crossed her mind. This was just the beginning. She had proven to herself that she could face challenges, even when they seemed daunting. But she also knew that life was full of obstacles, some small, some large, and she would continue to encounter them. The difference now was that she knew she had the strength to handle them. Later that evening, Maya sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea, reflecting on her journey. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worthwhile. She had grown in ways she hadn't expected, and the experience had shaped her into someone more resilient, more aware of the world around her, and more certain of her own ability to make a change. In the weeks that followed, Maya's life began to return to normal. The incident with the officer, while it had been a significant part of her story, was no longer at the forefront of her mind. She focused on her work, on her relationships with friends and family, and on the new goals she had set for herself. But every now and then, when she passed the parking lot where her car had been spray-painted, she would smile to herself. It wasn't just a memory of something that had gone wrong. It was a reminder of how she had handled it, of how she had stood up for herself and made sure the situation was addressed. Maya had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, and it didn't always come with immediate rewards. But it was worth it. It had taught her to trust her instincts, to be courageous in the face of adversity, and to never be afraid to speak up when something didn't feel right. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew she was ready to face them, with the confidence and strength she had gained from this experience. With a peaceful smile, Maya put down her cup of tea and looked out the window. The world was full of uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next.